In this video, I'm going to show you how to translate arguments into logic symbols. So here's our first argument. We have two premises and a conclusion in the argument. The first premise says, if you pull that fire alarm, you will get into trouble. So if we have an if-then conditional statement, the first part of the statement is, if you pull the fire alarm, we're going to let this part of the statement be represented by the letter F to indicate the statement if you pull the fire alarm. Then we'll let the second part of the statement be represented by T for you will get into trouble. So in logic symbols, we would say if you pull the fire alarm, then you'll get into trouble would be F implies T. This is that compound statement translated into symbols. The second premise is you got in big trouble, so that would be T, since T represents getting into trouble, and then you must have pulled the fire alarm would be F. The argument is, does this premise and this premise imply the conclusion? So if we're assuming that this premise and this premise is true, does that imply the conclusion? That's the argument. So basically, does premise 1, F implies T, and premise 2, T, imply the conclusion F? That's the argument. It's always, and arguments in this section are always of this form, premise 1 and premise 2. Does that imply the conclusion? So this should be familiar to you. It's a conditional where this whole part here, the premises, represents the antecedent, and this conclusion is the consequent. So if we were going to decide if this is valid or not and assume that the premises are true, what we want to do is find if there is a case where the premises are true and the consequent or conclusion is false. Right? That would be the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Here, let's look at translating another argument. So argument 2 is has these premises and conclusion. So the first premise is all persons living excellent lives are persons cherishing living. All folks who live well are persons cherishing living is the second premise, and then the third conclusion is all folks who live well are persons living excellent lives. So translating this first premise, we have all persons living excellent lives and persons cherishing living. So we'll call the people who live excellent lives E. That's the statement, people living excellent lives. And then we'll have C represent the statement, all persons cherishing living. So if it's a person that lives excellent life, then it should be a person that cherishes living. That's what the statement is saying. If all persons living excellent lives are persons who cherish living, then a person who lives excellent life implies a person who cherishes living. All folks who live well are persons cherishing living. So all folks who live well, we'll let that be W for well, implies someone who cherishes living. So W implies C. If it's a person that lives well, it's a person that cherishes living. That's the second premise. The conclusion is, okay, assuming these are true, does it follow that people who live well are people who live excellent lives? Does it follow that W, assuming these two are true, does it follow that W implies E? So the argument is, assuming the premises are true, which is the antecedent, if E implies C and W implies C, does that imply W implies E? Does it then follow that W implies E? So this would be our antecedent. This is our consequence. So what we're arguing or suggesting here is that if both E and W imply W, or if both E and W imply C, does W then imply E? That's the question. That's how you translate arguments into symbols.